All right, everybody, welcome to another Prog Report podcast, another Prog Report Top 5. As always, if you need to catch up on previous episodes, we're on iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, and on Podbean. Please subscribe, leave comments, give us 5 stars, whatever you feel like doing. And also for any news, interviews, reviews, and so on, we're always on Facebook, Twitter, and progreport.com. You know, on the Prog Report, we focus on mostly newer bands, the last sort of 25 years. It's sort of our niche. But of course, it's always fun to delve back into the classics, the biggest bands in the genre and the ones that paved the way and have all these classic albums. And what inspired this one, which is going to be Genesis Top 5 Songs, is I was recently asked to read and review a great new book called My Book of Genesis, which was written by a wonderful man named Richard Macphail, who was one of their childhood friends, grew up with all the members of the band, and eventually became their tour manager and manager all through those classic albums, and has a lot of great stories. So I am very pleased to welcome Richard, who happens to be in the States. Richard, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
No, thank you for away from your vacation. I know you're having a good time in the States and getting a few minutes, a little bit more than a few minutes with us, but I think it'll be a lot of fun, and it'll be a cool way to delve into some of the great stories that are in your book. So
thank you.
I'm excited about that. And of course, so we always need a great third guest. And this person has been on the Prog Report several times and contributed and put up with me bothering him many times on multiple occasions. And one of the best musicians, drummers in the world, and actually was on a Genesis album. So happy to welcome Nick DiVirgilio back to the show.
Well, how's it going, everyone? Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks, man. So, Nick, I want to just real quickly, because I don't know if we've talked about it on any of the interviews we've done, but why don't you recap a little bit about getting involved with Genesis, the Calling All Stations record, and sort of how that came about at the time?
It kind of happened by chance. I knew and played with a guy named Kevin Gilbert for many years. Well, not that many years, but for a while. And through Kevin, I got the gig with the band Tears for Fears. And while I was on tour over in the UK, I got a phone call from Kevin, and he told me that Phil Collins quit Genesis. And while I was in London, I should find their management office and go try and get an audition. So I did that. I went and I found where Hit and Run was. I had a day off, and I brought a Spock's Beard CD to light down there and invited all of them to come see the Tears for Fears show. And then just said, if I could get an audition sometime, that'd be really great. And I heard from Nick Davis about 6 months later.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you played on like about half the record, right? With another guy, Near was the other drummer?
Near Z is his name, yes.
Right, yeah, another fantastic drummer. How'd you guys split up who did what? How'd that happen?
They did that. I recorded everything they had, all of the songs on 2 different occasions, really. And they had Near come in and do the same thing, and they just picked what they wanted. Yeah,
because one of the songs you guys each play a half, right? Yep. Alien Afternoon. I think your first half, he's second half or something, which is, I always wondered how that happened. Richard, we're going to get to your great stories as well. Tell me a little bit about what brought you to write the book after all these years.
Well, I had a completely different career for the last 30 years. I was involved in energy efficiency and solar power and all of that kind of stuff. Alternative energy, I think, is also gets referred to, although it's a lot less alternative than it used to be, which is a good thing. But over the years, the fans always used to say to me, when are you going to write your version of the story? Because they put me on their album covers early on. There was a picture of me on Foxtrot, and they mentioned me on Trespass, and then their first live album, cunningly entitled Genesis Live, they actually dedicated it to me because that's when I first quit the band in 1973, and I retired from my energy business in 2015, and I thought, if there's ever going to be a time for me to do this book, it is now, because if I don't do it soon, goodness knows I might forget it all. So, I am not a writer, and I couldn't really feature the idea of sitting in front of a blank computer screen, getting frustrated. So Gail Coulson, whose name you may be familiar with, she managed Peter in the 70s. I first knew her when she was Tony Stratton Smith's PA when Genesis signed with Charisma in 1970, and she's been a good friend for all these years. And I was talking to her about it, and she suggested that I should get together with Chris Charlesworth. Now, I knew Chris Charlesworth from the days when he used to write for Melody Maker, and it turns out that he just retired, and so we got together and talked it through and worked something out. And I essentially went down to his house once a week right through the summer of 2016, and I spoke a chapter at a time, which he recorded and then transcribed, and then it turned it into the beginnings of the great work of literature that it has become.
Well,
I don't know what about that you think is funny.
I enjoyed it. It was sort of not in a bad way, but easy to read. It just kind of flowed. It was,
yes.
I went right through it in a couple of days, and I just couldn't put it down until it was done. And it was, a lot of interesting stuff. One of the things I think you mentioned just about the Genesis Live, they dedicated it to you, said, but they said something about Richard who has left us or something, right? And it sort of gave the impression maybe you were dead.
Unfortunate wording. Yeah. No one knows who I am, but a lot of people, whoever I am, they think I'm dead. And to be honest with you, it was almost one of the reasons I wrote the book.
Right. Right.
I could have called. I am not dead, but I think Phil got there first.
Phil stole that. Phil,
so,
he stole that title.
But
okay, so let's dive in, and we'll tell stories and talk about all the songs as we go. So what we're going to do here, because conquering just 5 songs from all the Genesis catalog at once is near impossible. What I've done, I've taken the liberty of splitting into 3 eras, sort of, and so Richard's going to take on the Peter Gabriel era, those albums, basically Trespass to Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and then Nick is going to do sort of the first 4 Phil-led albums, Phil-sung albums, and then I'm going to take what we'll dub the 80s era, Abacab through We Can't Dance. And I'll throw in an honorable mention to Calling All Stations, which I'm not really going to put in mind, but I do love that album. I don't care what anyone says about it. And if I was going to pick a song, I'd pick the title track because I think it's one of the best songs Genesis did. And I'm a big fan of that. So I'm just going to throw that out there.
That's cool.
Anyway, so Richard, I'm going to throw it to you first, and you're going to give us your number 5 pick for the Genesis top 5.
So my number 5 is Stagnation from Trespass.
Nice.
And the reason I've chosen this is because for me it's totally evocative of the time we spent at the cottage. What happened was that my parents had a cottage just south of London. And even though it was only an hour from the middle of London, it was very remote in the woods, a very beautiful place. In the summer of 1969, it was broken into and burgled. And after that, not unreasonably, my mother didn't really feel comfortable going there anymore. So they were going to sell it, but they were going to wait till the springtime because of the trees and everything. They thought it would sell better. So I suddenly thought, wow, this place is going to be empty, and maybe we could borrow it from them. And basically, that's what happened. The parents said yes, and we moved in as a band in the autumn of 1969, and were there right through until the spring of 1970. And one of the songs that was written at the cottage, and it's a classic Genesis song. It starts off with beautiful, jangly 12-string guitar piece that Mike and Phillips wrote together. and then it sort of builds up, and Tony has a great solo in it and everything else. But also, interestingly, it's of course Phil Collins hadn't joined the band yet. The drummer was John Mayhew, so I think it's a great representative song from that era.
Yeah, absolutely, incredible song. Around that time, Ant, I guess, started to announce that he wanted to leave, right? And what went on there? And you, I guess, were instrumental in keeping the band going.
Well, yes. I mean, we were fine at the Cottage, but we started to do more and more gigs. I mean, while we were there, mostly Peter and I would get on the phone while the others were rehearsing. We were kind of huddled around the corner in this little alcove and phoning up people to try and generate a bit of interest in the band. And we got ourselves an agent, a guy who acted as an agent for no fee. He wanted to manage the band, and the band weren't sure that he was the right guy. He was called Marcus Bicknell. But, to his credit, he started getting us a few gigs. And as time went on into the spring of 1970, Ant Phillips started to get the most terrible stage fright. And, we're not talking stadiums here. We were playing in clubs to 15 people, and he would be terrified out of his mind.
Wow.
And the stress and strain of it all caused him to get what we call glandular fever. I think you call it mono. And he was really unwell. And he decided, he told Peter that he was going to leave. Now, the news came out when we played the Marquee Club in Soho in London, a famous club. Obviously, everybody and their uncle have played at the Marquee, and I saw millions of bands there when I was younger. And Peter said, Ant's going to leave. And it seems strange now, but Ant really was, in terms of the direction of the band, he was the giant. He was far ahead as a writer, and the others were all a bit discouraged, even though, they'd made Trespass, it was coming out. They had the whole setup with Charisma Management, record company, everything was looking good. And I was astonished. Mike, Tony, Peter, and I sat in the back of the van because all the gear was on the stage. And after our set, and we had a kind of war cabinet. And as I said, I suddenly caught the tone of the thing, and they were all thinking, well, you can't do it without Ant, sort of stuff. And I just said, that is ridiculous. We have to go on. I know Ant's important, but he's not, nobody's irreplaceable. And Tony said, he didn't say much at the meeting, but he said, okay, he said, I'll accept that. I think we should go on. But if we are going to go on, we need to get another drummer. Because John Mayhew was fine, but, he wasn't really a drummer that was up to what Genesis needed. And so, long story short, as a result, we advertised for a drummer in the back of the Melody Maker, which is what everybody did in those days. And we got Phil. Yep. And without, what can I say?
It almost seems silly now, right? That in the Phil Collins answers a Melody Maker ad. I mean, it seems insane.
Yes, it does. But that's what happened. And the first time they rehearsed was down at a place called Farnham in Surrey, where Mike's parents lived. Mike and we set up for Mike and Phil to spend a day with Mike teaching Phil the songs. And of course, Phil didn't, you only had to tell him once, and he got it, and he started playing the songs, this music I knew really well, all the stuff from Trespass. And, with respect to all drummers, I did not believe the difference a drummer could make, a good drummer. I mean, he transformed the music. It's not hard for you to appreciate, but I was completely gobsmacked. And in fact, it was so good that it turned out replacing Ant was difficult. And it was some months before Steve Hackett came on the scene and sort of completed the holy circle. And we went on as a foursome. And we actually left Ant's amp on the stage over, stage right, and took a long cable. And Tony Banks got a Hohner electric piano with a fuzz box and used to play Ant solos with his right hand and play the organ chords with his left. And we did gigs for several weeks like that until finally Steve joined.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay. All right, let's stop there. Let's move on. Nick, you're number 5.
Well, my stories aren't going to compare to all.
I know. That's good.
That's awesome stuff there. We could sit here and listen to that for
Absolutely,
hours.
I know.
Okay, so this is really hard for me because at this point in time when these records I was a huge fan of all of these records in this Phil period. Definitely with the Peter period too. But I thought, you speaking about Phil as a drummer, I just thought he was on fire during these years as a drummer. So good. But the first one I'm going to pick, number 5, is actually a mellow song from Wind and Wuthering, Blood on the Rooftops.
Yeah.
I thought that was, I think that's kind of like a fan favorite from that era. I played drums all my life, but I had to learn, or at least try to play that opening guitar piece from Steve. It's just a cool, mellow, great Genesis ballad, killer melodies, very full sounding, and when the band comes in, good lyrics. It's a very cool track.
Let's hit the news, boy. I'll make some tea. Arabs and the Jews, boy. Too much for me. They get me confused, boy. Puts me off to sea. And the thing I hate, oh Lord, is staying up late to watch some remake on Salvation Day.
I think that was one of the main ones Steve wrote, if I remember correctly. I think that was one of his songs.
Yeah, it sounds like it, because it has that whole classical guitar opening thing. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and he brought that. He's been playing that live for a while on his Genesis Revisited tours, which is great. Richard, have you seen those Genesis Revisited shows?
I certainly have, 2 or 3 times, in fact. One particular
amazing.
show was at the Albert Hall, and in fact, it pertains to my number 3. So I
save that story.
Talk about that.
Save that story. All right, let me dive in on mine. So I'm gonna have a bunch of weird left field ones, and I might not go the hit route, although they have dozens during the 80s period. But I like the prog gear stuff, of course, and I'm gonna try and go a little bit obscure. One of my first choice for my number 5 is actually one that might not be that well known. It's a song called "You Might Recall," and it's on the studio side of the 3 Sides Live. I think it was a B-side to Paper Late, and I actually really got familiar with the song when I got the second Archives collection. I guess it just was one that I missed, but I really always really loved that song, and I think it absolutely should have been on Abacab. It was from those sessions. I don't know why they left it off, but I imagine just because LPs maybe had not as much room those days, missed the cut. But I love that song, and I think Phil has great vocals on it, and there's just sort of this great, Mike Rutherford arpeggio guitar stuff going on during the chorus, which is just very simple but very melodic and just perfectly played and always rings in your mind. So I'm picking that just because maybe if someone hasn't heard it, they'll check out that song, because I always loved it.
All my hopes were as the leaves upon the water, just something that I
You guys know that one?
I do
Yep.
very well. Yes.
Nice. All right, great. All right, Richard, let's hear another great story. What's your number 4?
Okay, well, my number 4 is Watcher of the Skies from
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
Foxtrot.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, obviously, back then, this used to open the show. So it was incredibly atmospheric and dramatic, the Mellotron opening. And of course, it brings to mind, I mean, one of the chapters in my book I called Mellotronics, because it was such a big thing at the time. We got the Mellotron between Trespass and Nursery Crime. And it was actually Steve. Steve was a huge King Crimson fan. And they used to play, it's almost like a residency for a while, at the famous said Marquee on a Sunday night with a jazz band, John Sermon, quite sort of abstract sort of jazz band. And Steve just completely fell in love with King Crimson. I first saw King Crimson when they were one of the bands in Hyde Park with the Rolling Stones, when the Stones played in the park, just after Brian Jones had died. And it was a very special day. But and I was blown away by King Crimson, the fact that they used to start with 21st Century Schizoid Man and that incredibly tight playing through that song. But Steve said, we must get a Mellotron because we need to sound more sort of orchestral, etc. And eventually because Tony Banks is, he can be quite a stubborn guy, so, as can Peter, and he didn't warm to the idea right away, but eventually he came around, and I remember Robert Fripp came round to, it was the first time I'd met Robert, he came round to the Charisma offices, and he explained about the Mellotron. I mean, in those days, it was just this monster, huge thing with 2 keyboards. And frankly, Tony would use, or any rock band would use, about 3% of what the thing was capable of. But there are so many times that, on the White Album, the Beatles, Bungalow Bill, there's a acoustic guitar run that opens that song. Well, that's on the Mellotron. That's a Mellotron.
Really?
But because there would have been one hanging about in at Abbey Road, and of course, I'm digressing, but the Beatles had huge amounts of time in the studio, and no doubt they were helped along by mind-bending substances of one type or another, and they would find these instruments, and they'd say, "What's this, George?" And it was like a harpsichord or a it's just because those instruments are just knocking about in the studio in case anyone needs them. And one of them was the Mellotron. But basically, the Mellotron had 3 basic sounds. It was strings, flute, and saxophone. And you could have them on their own, or you could blend them. And, if you listen to the music of the 60s and 70s, all sorts of people used them in various ways. And you hear it every now and again, and you go, there's the Mellotron. So the thing was designed to be put in a saloon bar of a pub, and somebody, if you were really clever, you could just be like an entire orchestra or jazz band or whatever it is you wanted to do with all of these different sounds. And, it wasn't, I don't want to go on too long, it was analog tape. It was pieces of tape with the notes recorded onto them. Right. And you hit the key, and the thing dropped down, and the tape ran over the head, and you got 8 seconds. And when you let it go, it sprang back, and then you could use it again. So it was the way Tony Banks is. He took this thing and he just really created some magic with it. So that's why I would choose Watcher of the Skies, because it's so evocative of that time, the Nursery Crime and Foxtrot era. And also another thing about the song is the lyrics were written by Mike and Tony, believe it or not, which is unusual because obviously Peter used to write a lot of the lyrics, but not all. And of course that was a bit of a portent of things to come, because obviously Mike and Tony got into writing lots of lyrics later. That's my number 4.
Watcher of the skies, watch revolt. Is the world alone? No world is his own. He whom life can no long surprise, raising his eyes, behold a planet unknown.
I love that song. I mean, everybody, any Genesis fan, that's an all-time classic. And the drumming on that also is
Yes,
Some of the
exactly.
greatest drumming ever. Yeah.
Yeah.
it's amazing. So,
Whoa. Yeah.
I mean, Nick, you guys from Spock's Beard, you guys had your share of Mellotron moments for sure.
Oh, that's a classic progressive rock instrument.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
Yeah. So great. Well, that's awesome. Okay, Nick, you're number 4.
A very cool song from Duke, Second Side, if you thinking in LP terms, the song Cul-de-sac.
Yeah.
Killer Tony Banks tune.
Yeah.
Sort of poppy, but they played it so heavy, and that's when Phil's drum sound was starting to change and starting getting into that, In the Air Tonight sort of Hugh Padgham thing a little bit. And so the sounds are huge. Killer melody, one of Phil's best singing performances, I think, ever. I really like the way he sings it. And the chord changes and everything in that tune from that Tony wrote was I was singing along to that in the car drive from home just this afternoon, and I still remember every lyric.
Right.
And I haven't listened to the song probably in, I don't know, 5-6 years or something.
That album is full of just gems like that. There's not a bad song on it. And you could go a million different ways.
Totally. Yeah. So that's my
really. I mean, Behind the Lines, I think is just
awesome stuff. I know. It's
Phil's
it's hard to
drumming
pick.
and singing on that
Yeah.
are just top of the.
Fantastic. I agree.
After all, you're not what you thought you were at all. You're just a natural fact. Another cool decide on nature's hard unwilling trail. Now all those dreams are gone. Will be stories left untold. Cut off in your pride, extinct until the end of time. You know you're on the way out, it's just a matter of time. You thought you'd rule the world forever. Long live the king, but don't spare the loser now.
Nice choice. Okay, so I'm gonna stay for my number 4, sort of in the Abacab world, but one from the actual album. One of my all-time favorite Genesis songs, the weird, sort of quirky "Keep It Dark,"
Yeah.
which man, that's a great song. I love the strangeness of the lyrics and the sort of off-time signature thing about how the song begins.
The sounds were getting so big then too. I mean, all the synth stuff that made that song so huge sounding, along with those big giant drums. It was a cool time period. Their sound was really morphing into something cool then.
Yeah, that's the album where they really sort of did away with acoustic guitar almost altogether. I'm not sure if there is any on the album at all. And
it was the 80s, so they were doing it. They were doing it, being hip to the time period for sure.
Yeah, but they found a lot of ways to still be different and above what everyone else was doing. I mean, I can't think of another band that would have written a song like "Keep It Dark" that from that era at all. So, that's another one of my favorites. That's my number 4. All right, Richard, your number 3.
Okay, well, you probably wouldn't be too surprised by this, but my number 3, I'm going back an album. This is the Musical Box.
Oh, well, yeah.
And, it's obviously an absolute Genesis classic. And one of the stories I tell in my book, which, by the way, if you don't mind me saying, is called My Book of Genesis, and it's available on Amazon.com as a book, Kindle, and very soon an audio book, which I just finished recording before we left England. So that's going to be available in a few weeks. It's quite interesting. I never done anything like that before. And I thought, what could be so difficult? Just sit down in front of a microphone and read your own blooming book. Well, I tell you, it's a very hard thing to do. I'd be getting into it, sort of moving, and he'd stop the thing. He'd say, you would hear your shirt rustling, and all of this. It was like, oh my God, never again. I clearly do not have a future as a voiceover artist. Please, I'll leave it to the professional actors. But anyway, right, I did get it done. So yeah, the Musical Box is, well, the thing is that what used to happen is that when there weren't gigs, which wasn't that often, we at this point we were gigging probably 5 nights a week, but on so-called days off, I would set the gear up in one or other of the various rehearsal studios that we used to use, and one of them was a guy called Rod Mayle, who's the brother of John Mayle. And he'd been in Flaming Youth with Phil, so that's why we knew that he had a rehearsal space. And I'd set the gear up at 9:30 in the morning, and the band would show up. They'd start writing and playing and rehearsing and whatever. And I'd go off and to get the microphones repaired or buy new drumsticks or more tambourines. I mean, we didn't have 2 brass farthings to rub together, but Peter didn't stop Peter smashing up his tambourines and usually a microphone every other gig. So I had to go off and get these things fixed and guitar strings and whatever. And then one day I got back to the rehearsal room about 4:30 or 5, and they were all looking a bit smug. And they said, listen, sit down. We've got something to play you. We just finished a song. And I sat down and they played me the Musical Box. And, I was just in tears by the end of it, especially that it's got the most incredible climax and ending.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And, of course, the fans took to it just completely from the get-go. And it was just always a brilliant live song. And that's where the Steve Hackett Genesis Revisited thing comes in, because I just went to the Albert Hall, and Steve and Joe very generously got Maggie and I a ticket in the box. We were sitting with Steve's brother, John, he's a wonderful flute player. And they played the Musical Box, and the audience just went bonkers. And there I was thinking, Jesus Christ, it's 40 years later, and it's still having the same effect. It was.
Steve is really keeping that old music alive in a great way.
Absolutely, I love that, and he's got a great bunch of musicians. He's got really good people. I mean, I always say about tribute bands that they stand or fall on their drummer, because lots of people, can play the key, they can learn the keyboard parts, the guitar parts, but, to really sound anything like Genesis, you've just got to have a really good drummer. And amazingly, there are lots of, thankfully, good ones around. So yeah, present company not accepted. So this is, that's my number 3.
Old King Cole was a merry old soul, and a merry old soul was he. So he called for his pipe, and he called for his bowl, and he called for his fiddlers 3. The clock tick-tock on the mantelpiece, and I want, and I feel, and I know, and I touch the wall.
Yeah, that's one of my all-time favorite songs. Seeing it live, it just gets you so. The ending is just so powerful. It's the most powerful live song I think I've ever seen. It really just has that incredible effect on you when you see it.
And the other thing, of course, I should say is that that's the song International Stadium in Dublin, where Peter went off during the instrumental section in the middle and came back on stage for the first time with the red dress and the fox's head.
That's right. Yeah.
Completely blew everybody's mind. If you could have seen Tony's face. No, but the thing is, of course, they just brought the house down. So, because if he'd said, by the way, guys, I'm thinking of, red dress, Tony Banks, he just would have refused. He said, I'm leaving the band if you do that. I don't know. But but Pete, that's the way Peter knew he had to do it. It was all or nothing. And of course, Tony after that couldn't argue. So the next thing we get is Peter dressed up as a sexually transmitted disease, as the Slipper Man. And none of us thought it was ever going to go quite that far. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So
that's amazing.
Over to you.
That's one of the stories that I really it hit me when I was reading your book, was that moment when they show you the musical box for the first time, and I'm thinking to myself, imagine being the person that heard this song for the first person to ever hear it. That's an amazing. I can't imagine being that. That's very lucky. That's awesome.
I am very lucky, and I don't ever forget it.
That's very cool. Yeah. Nick, you're number 3.
My number 3 comes from the album, And Then There Were Three, which it's right up there with one of my favorites they ever did. Yeah. You could hear the excitement in the guys as a 3-piece trying to do their thing, and I absolutely love it. So that my song is The Lady Lies.
Yep.
It's sort of a classic. It's very progressive, it's the tip end. And one cool thing, I grew up loving hard rock as well, even though I'm such a punk head. And that record really rocks. It's very aggressive sounding, even the ballads, and the drumming on that record, on that song is killer. Good story. Very typical, probably they go all over the place, and it's just one of my favorites. They used to nail that song live too. If you ever heard some of their old recordings, they would play with Chester playing and everybody. They would really kick that song in the butt. It's cool.
Yeah.
Going back to Phil, underrated. Some of his drumming on this album is insane, and like on Down and Out on the first track. That drum beat is really ridiculous. Just to think of doing those drum beats, the things that he was thinking of doing at the time were so advanced, I thought. And there's a bunch of great songs on the album. It is one of their best albums.
Come with me, I need you. I feel gone. I live all alone. I'll give you one. Something special I've done if you like. Come to my garden, taste the fruits and the spices of love. You come to kiss me. I'm the kind that your dreams tell you of.
For my number 3, I'm gonna jump to, I guess we'll call it the last Genesis album with the lineup, the main 3-person lineup with Phil as the final track, the long epic Fading Lights, which that album sort of is a weird album because some of it is, they bring back a little bit of the proggy stuff, and some of it is super pop and could have been Mike and the Mechanics albums and stuff. So it's sort of a weird combination of everything that everybody from the band was writing or doing at the time. But I like Fading Lights a lot for obviously the long instrumental section in the middle, which sort of is, I felt like putting that as the last song, and I think maybe they knew it might have been the last album, even though they don't say at the time that they knew, but calling back to the old 70s classic solo stuff and bringing that back a little bit. And tying everything together. Plus, Phil's vocals and lyrics are very touching and moving throughout that song. And it had. I'm glad that they found a way to put another long epic back in the catalog there.
I enjoyed it. You know, that was when that stuff came out. It was like right in my end of my high school years. I got to go see them play that on that tour at Dodger Stadium. My first ever gigantic epic, enormo show, with the screens moving and filling. You know, it was cool. I think it has its moments. I think it's they were just doing their thing, and
it's weird to have that song on the same album as I Can't Dance. Like how they found a way to put all that stuff together, which it really, it's like two completely different bands, but that's just where they were at the time, and as big as anything. I mean, it was crazy.
They were one of the biggest band in the world at that time. I mean,
yeah.
Yep.
And these are the days of our lives. So love.
Richard, when you listen to the We Can't Dance album or something, coming from being there when they were writing Musical Box, what's your sort of perspective on the difference?
Well, it probably won't surprise you if I say it's not my favorite era. You know, I don't know. It doesn't particularly pertain to this last choice, but I remember reading an interview that Mike gave a long time ago, and someone essentially said, "Why do you write such long songs?" And you know, Mike is very. Somebody described him as lazily perceptive, which he is, and he said very honestly, he said, "Well, short songs are very difficult," and you know, he's right. You know, you think of the Beatles and ABBA, those hits, those short songs, and they're absolute works of genius. And you know, they basically, as you well know, I'm sure, that Genesis used to, everybody would come up with what they call bits. Right. And they would sit down to rehearse, and someone would say, well, I've got this bit, you know, and this is like this guitar thing or a chord sequence, and then someone else would say, well, I've got this bit, you know, and one of the cleverest things is that Tony Banks, being a classically trained musician, you know, he knew he had incredible, well, Steve Hackett called him the chord king. And he was the guy who puts things together and make them flow together in a really beautiful way. So that's one of the things that makes them very special. You know, I mean, I'm inevitably going to be lean towards the era that you've asked me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well,
that's not going to be a surprise to anybody.
No, I would think. So leading into then your number 2 choice. My
number 2, okay. Well, it's from The Lamb. It's Fly on the Windshield.
Oh, killer.
And yeah, I mean, Tony Banks said, I interviewed all of the band for the book, except for Peter, actually. Peter wrote the foreword, and he wrote a really beautiful foreword, and I'm ever grateful to him for that. But when I was talking to Tony, he said that at that moment, it's one of his most favorite Genesis moments is the big bang in Fly on a Windshield, you know, as the fly hits the windshield, and the great moment, you know, everything goes crazy, and it is just staggering. So it just still brings, you know, the hairs stand up on the back of my neck when I hear it, even to this day. And Peter's lyrics are just brilliant, you know. It's just a great moment. And you know, of course, The Lamb was not an easy time. Peter was really struggling with being married, having a child, and all of that. And in fact, he sort of was showing signs of wanting to leave. And Tony Stratton Smith came down. They were down on a farm in Wales with a mobile recording unit. And Strat basically persuaded Peter to stay. And because of that, they managed to complete the Lamb. But, it's no secret that there was the band and there was Peter. And they were working on the music and he was writing the lyrics. And Peter has never found lyric writing easy. Everyone's heard the story probably when Daniel Lanois locked him he didn't lock him. He nailed him into the studio. He got a piece of wood and he got the roadies to give him 2 nails and a hammer. And he just said, I'm going to nail you in and not let you out until you've completed the lyrics for XYZ, whatever it was, the song. Because he's always got lots of songs on the go, and the lyrics always come later. I mean, I would always maintain that his lyrics are worth waiting for. But, the whole thing was his concept. He wrote all the lyrics for that. And the fact that it burgeoned into a double album and was late, and, they went on the road, did the thing the band should never do, which is go on tour with your album not in the shops. It was just a recipe for disaster. So as faithful as the fans were, they were listening to this stuff that they'd never heard before, and with Peter doing all these crazy costumes and all the rest of it, and really they were wondering what the hell it was all about. But of course, in the middle of it all, there's an awful lot of incredible music. But,
totally.
I could have chosen, for instance, Riding the Screen. I actually did choose that, and then I crossed it out and decided to put Fly on a Windshield. So, it's flawed. The Lamb is a flawed album, but it's still a great one for all that. So that's my number 2.
The wind is blowing harder now, blowing dust into my eyes. The dust settles on my skin, making a crust I cannot move. And I'm hovering like a fly, waiting for the windshield on the freeway.
Yeah, I mean, Nick, you did a whole remake of the entire album at one point, right? So what did you learn from recreating these songs?
That it's very cool songwriting. You break down some of these really elaborate tunes like In the Cage, Slipperman, and Back in New York City and stuff, and you'll find that the chord progressions can be really simple. It's just the way these guys just played the parts and the life they gave them. So some really cool tunes when you really dove into learning all the really nitty gritty parts. It's such an awesome record for that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, so Nick, you're number 2 then.
Well, this is a really tough thing to pick 5. I mean, I love all of these tunes so much. I'm going to go to Trick of the Tail. I tried to pick something from every record.
Sure.
That you gave me. Trick of the Tail, Robbery, Assault, and Battery.
Yeah.
Again, when I grew up when I was, from probably 10 to this day, but around that time period, I consumed anything Phil Collins played drums on, and including these records like every day. I was seriously, it was a passion for a while. And his drumming, and it was really starting to, his fusion period, he was doing lots of really cool stuff, but all in this, and it was just always also groovy. So you took this really cool, fun tune where he's almost playing like a disco beat for a bunch of it, still trying to be progressive and really cool lyrics and the way he sang. Just a lot of fun. I love this tune. The whole middle section, that's keyboard solo thing that Tony plays in the middle is I've never seen anybody else be able to play that correctly. So
yeah. Richard, what do you remember from that time of,
Well, I was just thinking, about you saying how you consumed everything that Phil did. It made me think about Brand X, and
Oh my gosh, yeah.
because they were an amazing band. I
They
mean,
were.
Percy Jones is just one of the great bass players, unsung, I have to say. I think,
True. Very true.
yeah. What I love is that there were no boundaries for Phil, and he would take what he learnt, if you like, playing that kind of music with Brand X, and bring it to Genesis, and
Sure.
it really, really enriched their music, I think.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Robbery, assault and battery, Evan and his felony. Robbery, assault and battery, Evan and his felony.
My second choice. This is one of my favorite albums. It was really the beginning for me, my introduction into Genesis, because the classic albums were created a little before or during my very toddler years. And so the self-titled album, or the Genesis album, however you want to call it, is one of my all-time favorite albums. I think it's an amazing record. Even though it has that 80s sort of feel to it, but going from that, I'm picking Home by the Sea, and I'm going to slash it with Second Home by the Sea, because we'll make that one song. But they just had a unique way of lyric writing and writing things that were different and original and not cliched. And Tony Banks at that time was just always incorporating new and unique sort of keyboard sounds, and I love everything about that album, but especially these two tunes, and the whole instrumental section is just one of their best moments for me from that era.
And live too is so incredible.
Yeah,
on those later tours, it just went down so well.
Really. Yeah, I mean that whole album for me, it is a little bit of a different style band, but there's sort of the classic albums, Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, Selling England by the Pound, and whatever. And this one is maybe parallel for me, not better or worse, but equal on its sort of a different wavelength, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that it has this very special place for me, that album.
I drift without direction, eyes that hold despair. Things from the side and they moan. Help us, someone, let us out of here. We're living here so long on the star, dreaming of the time we were free. So many years ago, before the time when we first heard, welcome to the home by the sea. Sit down, sit down, sit down, sit down, sit down, as we relive our lives in what we tell you.
Okay, so Richard, back to your number one, which
I'm really nervous now, having to just choose one more.
Yeah.
Actually, I didn't have a lot of trouble choosing this. You mentioned Selling England by the Pound, so my number one is The Cinema Show.
nice.
And it is so much I could say about it. It's such a classic Genesis song, starting with the guitars and the really lyrical Peter's beautiful lyrics about Romeo and Juliet and his chocolate surprise. It's full of humor, and it is just a complete classic song of two halves. Just on the day that the World Cup started. I don't know if you're familiar. There's a dreadful cliche that soccer managers come out with in British football when they're talking about a game. And the soccer manager will say, Well, it was a real game of two halves. And, well, yes, actually. But anyway, that's what a cinema show is, because halfway through, they just go into this thing. And there's Mike doing this wonderful, fantastic, fast strumming guitar. Phil's drumming, again, is just sublime. And Tony Banks is just totally killing it. And there's a wonderful moment when the bass pedals come in, because, Mike, they didn't really have a bass player. It's sort of crazy, but they made it work really well. And the moment when the bass pedals come in, and then there's that incredible, it is basically, it's Romeo and Juliet having sex. That's what that is. I may be wrong, but that's my interpretation. And there's a climatic moment. And one of the stories I tell in my book, I actually wasn't working with them, but they were on the road to doing this album, and they were about to go on tour in America. Their biggest tour to date by a long way. And the lighting guy, it's called Les Adey. I won't go into the whole story, but basically he was busted a week before the tour started, and he couldn't do the tour. And I was sort of busy doing other things, but not sort of, impossibly tied up. And either they needed to get somebody who knew about lights but didn't know the music, or vice versa. They needed someone who knew the music but who could learn about the lights. And they thought, well, Rich could do it. So they asked me if I would go with them, and I did. And they used to use Shoko out of Dallas, for sound and lights. And I did the first show, and the guy at the end said, I need to teach you how to do a crossfade. Because I just sort of switched one lot off and switched the other lot on, and it looked dreadful. But I got better at it. And my favorite thing in the whole show was in the cinema show, when it reaches that climactic moment, because there's just three of them on stage. Phil and Pete, Steve and Pete have gone, and they had these really bright white, directly vertical. It was almost like a precursor to the classic, the white lights straight down thing. Yeah. And at that very moment, I switched everything off and just those white lights, and it was a brilliant effect. It really did look great. And it is just a absolutely wonderful piece of music. And again, the way Tony uses, the synthesizer, and then the organ, and then the mellotron and the bass pedals, the whole thing, it's a fantastic one. So, if you sent me away to a desert island and said you could only ever have one Genesis song again, I think, it would, if it wasn't Sup Is Ready, it would have to be Cinema Show.
It's tough. Imagine you have this list of 5 songs that you picked, which no one on earth could argue with, and it doesn't even have Supper's Ready.
I know.
And that's how incredible.
Oh, can I change my mind?
Yeah, that's right. But that's the part that you're talking about. That's the sort of where Tony Banks is doing that simple solo. That
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
so there's favorite songs that I have, and then there's just favorite moments of songs that I have.
Yeah.
And that part is one of my all-time favorite moments. It's one of my ringtones on my phone. It's that part.
Yeah.
Can't argue with that choice, but I'm sure Supper's Ready is maybe 5A or number 6 for you.
I know.
But all right, Nick, you're number one.
Well, you mentioned this song earlier, and I have to pick it because, again, it exudes everything that the band was doing at the time and their musicianship at the time, and it's Down and Out from And Then There Were Three.
Yeah.
What a song is on fire, man. Phil is singing like a monster there. His voice is so powerful, and it's a rocking tune, and that drum beat is serious. It's a serious deal. It's a heavy duty tune, and it just gives me so much energy when I listen to it. So I love that record, and I thought that was a different choice, because again, there's a million tunes I could choose. A Dance on a Volcano, a Squonk, anything from Trick of the Tail, probably. There's such Afterglow.
Yeah. A lot of these are sort of left field choices for most people, but they're incredible songs. It's like I was saying. I mean, you can't. None of these songs you could want to kick out, and then you still have all these amazing songs that you didn't even pick. So
right. No, I really dig that tune. I think it's very enjoyable for me to hear.
No, I agree. I mean, that's what a lot of people talk about. They were, going away from the prog era, but that song alone is proggy in every way.
That whole record, it's still very much a prog record. Just it has a little bit of that rock and roll. It has a little angst to it, I think, that record, and in a very good way.
It's good to be here. How you been? Check my backboard. Where's my room? I sit on the phone. That's my game. Keep up the pressure on the way. I don't wanna be about the bush. But none of us are getting any younger. There's people out there who will take your place. I'm not the best of you.
So if you look at my list, one thing by the end is going to be noticed that I don't have a song from Invisible Touch on my list, and I'm unfortunately I'm going to stay with that. I'm not having a song from Invisible Touch on my list. My number one is going to be Mama from the self-titled album again, and that's in my all-time favorite Genesis songs. Easy. It's extremely powerful. Everything about it, the build up at the end, Phil's vocals, the haunting chords, the whole thing is it's dark, it's ominous, it's heavy, but the way it builds at the end is so powerful, and his screaming it sets the hairs on your arms up. So that was when I was picking my 5, right away I knew that was going to be my number one before I even filled out the rest of my list. And I ended up looking at my list and I said, well, I don't have any Invisible Touch songs on here, but I just couldn't find one to put. I don't hate that album. I couldn't find a song to put on in my top 5 out of any of these.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, really.
I
mean, this is an impossible game. Let's
Totally, yeah. You're right.
yeah.
It's hot, too hot for me, mama. But I can't hardly wait. When my eyes, they're burning, mama, and I can feel my body shake. Don't stop me, mama. I'll make the pain, make it go away. No, I won't hurt you, mama, but it's getting so hard.
You guys have chosen some fantastic songs, and it's really good, the thought you put into it, and I appreciate it a lot.
It's really cool to see this when I'm writing these down as you guys are doing the choices. I mean, when you look at it, it would be such a cool best of just these. You know, it's such a eclectic mix of material. It really goes sort of all over the place, and really, really cool, really interesting. So that part of the book, which I want to just touch on before we let you go, and it doesn't just end with the Genesis period, because then you had a long period working with Peter Gabriel, right? So, talk a little bit about that.
Well, after Peter left, after The Lamb, he took what now would be called a gap year. You know, he basically, he walked right out of the machinery, as he said, in Salisbury Hill. Yeah. And his first daughter had been born, and then Melanie, who sang with Peter later, she came along, and basically he just wanted to be with his family down in the countryside outside Bath, and being a dad and growing vegetables and exploring lots of other things, lots of aspects of his spiritual life. And I was kind of always part of that. And then, he made what has become known as Car, his first self-titled, annoyingly self-titled
right,
solo albums. And, and then, of course, inevitably, the talk was of a tour. And he and I were talking on the phone, and basically, I think he was quite nervous about it, not unreasonably. He didn't know how it was going to go down. Salisbury Hill hadn't been released; it wasn't a hit yet, and he said he'd really love to have me along. So I did, and dusted off the old briefcase, and out we went. And we had another couple of years of great adventures together, including getting arrested as terrorists in Switzerland, which is one of the chapters in the book. And
I'm gonna have to get the book.
Yeah, that's what you meant to say. So yeah, I mean, it was amazing, and I also had talk about my outings. Well, firstly with Brand X, I did their first American tour without Phil, with a drummer. I don't know if you know him. He's called Kenwood Denard. Woody.
I know him very well. He's a killer drummer.
Yeah, he's a fantastic drummer, and he after the first show, perfectly understandably, he went out and got a T-shirt made with "Where's Phil" in very large letters on the front, because that's all anyone said to him. But poor guy, he did a great job. And then Peter Hamill from Van der Graaf Generator, I did a couple of tours with, one over here and one in Europe, and then and Leonard Cohen. Leonard Cohen was the last tour I did, but again, that's all in the book.
Very, very interesting of you to have done. You've done a lot in this.
I have.
It's quite a amazing amount of stories in the book,
a full and rich life.
Absolutely, and thank you for all your contributions to the Genesis, archive, I guess we'll call it.
Well, you're very welcome. You're very welcome.
So again, Nick, I also want to give you a shout out because the new Spock's Beard is out, which you are on Noise Floor, which is just awesome. Any Spock's Beard fans, pick up. It's the 13th album. What else you got going on?
I got two big train shows coming up in July. One in Basingstoke, south of London, there as a warm-up.
Very well.
And at the Anvil, as it's called. And then we're playing at Lorelei, the Night of Prog. We're headlining Friday night.
It's an amazing place.
Yeah. So I'll play on July 13th. I'll be playing that show. And lots of big train stuff coming in the future. A live DVD in November, and then another record in 2019. We're working on it now, but it'll be released sometime in 2019.
Awesome. Big Train, another amazing band, one of my favorites. So happy to see that happen. We still need a US show, Nick. You got to make
that's it all in the cards, believe me.
Got to make that happen. All right, cool. So we got a lot to recap. My book of Genesis by our friend Richard Macphail is out on Amazon. Look for it and read this great book. You got Spock's Beard, Noise Floor, and Big Train shows to catch up on. Guys, thank you so much for giving me an hour of your time on this. This was a dream for me to do and talk about all this stuff. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really
All right.
enjoyed it.
Yeah, Richard, and enjoy the rest of your time in the U.S. and the safe trip back home.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you
Nick.
so much.
All right,
Yeah.
guys.
Talk to you soon. Thank you.
All the best.
Bye,
Bye.
Nick.
Bye-bye, Richard.